There's a country in Africa that most people can't even find on a map. A thin slice of land wedged between bigger nations, where nearly 70% of the population lives below the poverty line. But here's what nobody talks about. From 1966 to 1994, this small nation operated one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships, with over 6,000 political killings documented during its reign of terror. And then something remarkable happened. Today, in 2025, this same country has transformed into one of Africa's most surprising democratic success stories. The question isn't just how they survived decades of tyranny, but how they emerged stronger. The answer begins with understanding how geography itself became a weapon. The geography that shaped a nation's isolation. Finding Malawi on a map requires genuine effort. The country sits compressed between three much larger neighbors, with Tanzania stretching across its northern border, Zambia wrapping around the western edge, and Mozambique forming a massive curve that nearly swallows the southern half. At just 45,747 square miles, Malawi is smaller than Pennsylvania, yet it houses over 20 million people within its narrow boundaries. The nation stretches roughly 560 miles from north to south, but measures only 100 miles across at its widest point, creating a geographic fingerprint that resembles a thin vertical stripe squeezed between continental giants. The country's defining feature is Lake Malawi itself, the fourth largest freshwater body on Earth by volume and ninth largest by surface area. This massive body of water extends 350 miles along the eastern border, reaching depths of 2,300 feet and making it the second deepest lake in Africa. The lake's sheer size transforms it into both a blessing and a barrier. While it provides fish, transportation, and fresh water for millions, it also creates a natural boundary that historically limited movement and communication between communities along its shores. The western shore, where most Malawians live, developed in relative isolation from the eastern regions, and entire districts remained cut off from each other for generations. The Great Rift Valley system that carved out Lake Malawi also shaped the country's plateaus and terrain in ways that reinforced isolation. The Shire River Valley runs north to south through the center of the country, creating a natural corridor that became the primary route for trade and communication. But this geographic funnel also meant that anyone controlling key points along the valley could effectively control the entire nation. The highlands that rise on either side of this central valley create natural barriers between different regions, with the Nika Plateau in the north, the Central Region Plateaus, and the Shire Highlands in the south forming distinct geographic and cultural zones. These physical barriers weren't just inconveniences for travelers. They created conditions where entire populations could be controlled, monitored, and oppressed without the outside world taking notice. The landlocked nature of the country meant that all imports and exports had to pass through neighboring countries, making Malawi dependent on the goodwill of its neighbors for access to international markets and communication. This geographic dependence would later become a tool of control, as authoritarian leaders could restrict movement and information flow with minimal international oversight. The country's compact size created another crucial factor in its eventual oppression. Unlike vast nations where remote regions might escape government control, Malawi's small territory meant that a determined authoritarian could extend his reach into every village and district. Most Malawians live in rural subsistence farming communities scattered across the countryside, making systematic surveillance and control more manageable for a regime with sufficient resources and ruthless determination. Malawi's stunning natural beauty provided perfect cover for what would unfold in the political realm. The country boasts some of Africa's most spectacular landscapes, from the crystal-clear waters of Lake Malawi to the rolling tea plantations of the southern highlands. The Mulonge Massif rises dramatically from the surrounding plains, creating a mountain fortress that seems to touch the clouds. These scenic vistas attracted the attention of researchers, missionaries, and the occasional tourist, but they also created a false impression of tranquility and progress that masked the reality of daily life for ordinary Malawians. The isolation worked in multiple directions. While geographic barriers made it difficult for information about conditions inside Malawi to reach the outside world, they also prevented outside influences from penetrating the country. International media had limited presence. Foreign diplomats concentrated in the capital city of Lilongwe, and most international organizations maintained minimal staff. This meant that systematic human rights abuses could occur across the country without generating the kind of international attention that might have pressured for change. The positioning between larger neighbors created additional layers of isolation. Tanzania to the north had its own internal challenges and limited interest in Malawi's affairs. Zambia to the west was dealing with its own political transitions and economic difficulties. Mozambique to the south and east was engulfed in a devastating civil war that lasted from 1977 to 1992, making it both unable and unwilling to pay attention to conditions in Malawi. This regional context meant that even if Malawians had tried to flee oppression, they would have found limited refuge in neighboring countries that were struggling with their own crises. The lake that gives the country its name also contributed to psychological isolation. While Lake Malawi connected communities along its shores, it also created a sense of being cut off from the broader world. Many Malawians lived their entire lives without traveling beyond their immediate region, and the lake's vast expanse reinforced the feeling that they inhabited a world separate from the rest of Africa. This geographic psychology would later be exploited by authoritarian leaders who convinced populations that they were unique, special, and needed to be protected from outside influences. The combination of geographic isolation, small size, landlocked position, and limited strategic importance created perfect conditions for authoritarian control. A determined dictator could seal the borders, control information flow, and operate with minimal international oversight. The physical landscape that made Malawi one of Africa's most beautiful countries also made it one of the easiest to transform into a prison. The same features that attracted praise from the few visitors who made it to the country also enabled a level of oppression that would have been much more difficult to achieve and maintain in a larger, more connected, or more strategically important nation. But geography alone doesn't create dictators. It merely provides the stage where they can perform their darkest acts. The transformation of this isolated paradise into a totalitarian nightmare required something else entirely. The right person with the wrong intentions. The making of Africa's most unlikely dictator. That person emerged from the most unlikely of backgrounds. Hastings Banda was born in the early 20th century near Kasungu in rural Malawi, baptized into the Church of Scotland and given a Christian name that reflected the missionary influence already spreading across the region. His early years followed a familiar pattern for ambitious young Africans of his generation. In 1917, he left his village to work in the gold mines of Johannesburg, South Africa, where thousands of young men from across southern Africa sought better opportunities than subsistence farming could provide. The trajectory of Banda's life changed dramatically when he met Bishop William Tuma Vernon of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Vernon recognized something in the young man and offered to sponsor his education in the United States, a gesture that would have consequences no one could have predicted. In 1925, Banda departed for America, beginning an educational journey that would span decades and multiple continents. He enrolled at the Wilberforce Institute in Ohio, where he earned his diploma before pursuing pre-medical studies at Indiana University. He then transferred to the University of Chicago, where he completed a degree in history. The combination of scientific and humanistic education created a complex intellectual foundation that would later inform his worldview in troubling ways. Banda understood both the mechanics of human biology and the sweep of historical forces, knowledge that would prove dangerous when combined with unlimited political power. His medical training taught him about human vulnerability and suffering, while his historical studies showed him how power operated across different societies and time periods. To practice medicine within the British Empire, Banda needed British credentials, so he traveled to Edinburgh to earn his medical degree in 1941. During his studies, He received financial support from multiple sources, including the Nyasaland government and the Church of Scotland, though neither organization knew the other was contributing. This ability to manipulate different benefactors without their knowledge demonstrated a skill for deception that would later serve him well in politics. During World War II, he chose to serve as a civilian doctor in northern England rather than as an army physician, citing conscientious reasons that suggested a commitment to healing over violence. Banda's medical practice in Britain built his reputation as a compassionate physician who genuinely cared for his patients. He was known for his kindness to children, his courtesy during house calls, and his willingness to treat poor patients without charge. Journalist Caroline Alexander noted his generosity in London, even covering rents for poor patients when times were particularly tough. This image of a caring doctor created a public persona that would later provide devastating cover for his authoritarian tendencies. People who knew him during this period found it impossible to believe that the gentle physician could become a brutal dictator. His political involvement began in London, where he became active in the Pan-African independence movement. He hosted other African leaders and represented the interests of the Nyasaland African Congress, advocating for his homeland's rights to the British colonial office and parliament. He strongly opposed the federation between Nyasaland and Rhodesia, calling it a stupid scheme to ensure that white supremacy remained in Central Africa, even if the British colonial government was no more. His opposition to this federation became a defining political position that would later help him gain power. Even during his London years, however, warning signs of his authoritarian nature began to emerge. He developed a sense of superiority that manifested in his treatment of other Nyasaland political leaders and Pan-African figures. He frequently belittled their intelligence and capabilities, suggesting that he alone possessed the vision and competence necessary to lead. His personality revealed itself through a rigid moral code and disapproval of what he considered lax behavior, including public displays of affection and extramarital affairs. Banda's limited trust in his fellow Malawian politicians became apparent as he increasingly preferred the counsel of his British friends over African colleagues. Despite being a staunch anti-colonialist in his public statements, he showed no hesitation in collaborating with South Africa's apartheid government when it served his interests. This willingness to abandon principles for practical advantage revealed a pragmatic ruthlessness that few recognized at the time. The transformation from healer to oppressor began during his rise to power, but the process was gradual enough that many observers missed the warning signs. His medical training, which had taught him to understand human suffering, became a tool for inflicting it more effectively. The knowledge of human anatomy and psychology that made him a skilled physician also made him uniquely capable of designing systems of control and punishment. His understanding of how bodies and minds could be broken gave him insights that purely political leaders lacked. In 1962, Banda asserted his role as Malawi's sole policymaker, expecting unwavering obedience from government officials without dissent or criticism. This early behavior foreshadowed the autocratic rule he would later establish, but many people interpreted his demands for loyalty as necessary leadership during a critical transitional period. The context of decolonization provided cover for increasingly authoritarian behavior, as supporters argued that strong leadership was essential for national unity and development. His return to Nyasaland in 1958 marked the beginning of his transformation from respected expatriate to political leader. He quickly assumed leadership of the Nyasaland African Congress, shifting authority away from the previous president through a combination of charisma and political maneuvering. He embarked on a speaking tour that rallied support for independence and challenged the colonial government's authority. His message resonated with people who had been waiting for a leader who could articulate their grievances and aspirations. The colonial government recognized the threat Banda posed and imprisoned him in 1959, a move that only enhanced his political standing. His imprisonment transformed him from a political leader into a martyr, and his release became a rallying cry for the independence movement. The irony was that the colonial authorities' attempt to suppress him actually accelerated his rise to power by giving him the credibility that comes from suffering for one's beliefs. By the time independence negotiations began in earnest, Banda had positioned himself as the indispensable leader of the Malawian independence movement. His medical credentials, international education, and political imprisonment created a perfect resume for leadership. The British colonial authorities, eager to hand over power to a stable successor, saw in Banda exactly what they wanted to see: a Western-educated, English-speaking moderate who could maintain order and stability. They could not have been more wrong about what they were unleashing upon the Malawian people. The cabinet crisis that revealed a monster. Independence arrived for Malawi on July 6, 1964, bringing with it the promise of democratic governance and self-determination that had motivated the long struggle against colonial rule. The new nation's cabinet represented the intellectual and political elite who had fought for freedom, including ministers like Henry Chipembra, Kanyama Kayum, and Orton Chirwa. These men had worked alongside Banda for years, believing they were building a democracy that would serve the interests of all Malawians. Just 7 weeks after independence, however, the democratic facade began to crumble. The catalyst was a fundamental disagreement over foreign policy that revealed the deep philosophical divide between Banda and his cabinet. The ministers wanted to align Malawi with other African nations in opposition to apartheid South Africa and Portuguese colonial rule in Mozambique. They pushed for severing diplomatic and economic ties with these white minority regimes and sought to establish relationships with China and other socialist countries that were offering aid to newly independent African nations. Banda viewed these proposals as direct challenges to his authority and judgment. He had maintained relationships with South Africa and Portugal throughout his time in London, seeing them as practical necessities rather than moral compromises. The idea of accepting aid from China particularly infuriated him, as he saw it as an invitation for communist influence in Malawi. His opposition wasn't just political but personal, as he interpreted his ministers' advocacy for these policies as questioning his leadership and undermining his vision for the country. The crisis escalated when the ministers began organizing among themselves, discussing their concerns about Banda's increasing authoritarianism and his tendency to make unilateral decisions without consulting the cabinet. They were particularly troubled by his growing reliance on a small circle of advisors and his dismissive attitude toward their input on major policy matters. The ministers believed they were fulfilling their democratic duty by providing checks and balances on executive power, but Banda saw their coordination as conspiracy. On September 7, 1964, Banda moved with stunning speed to eliminate his opposition. He dismissed Chipembra and 2 other ministers outright, including some of the most prominent figures in the independence movement. When other ministers resigned in protest, showing solidarity with their dismissed colleagues, Banda used his parliamentary allies to launch a devastating counterattack. He accused the former ministers of conspiring against the government, abusing their positions, and harboring dangerous loyalties to foreign powers, particularly the Chinese ambassador. The accusations were crafted with surgical precision, designed to discredit the ministers while positioning Banda as the defender of Malawi's sovereignty. He claimed that the ministers had been meeting secretly with foreign diplomats, planning to undermine the government's policies, and working to replace him with a more compliant leader. These charges, while largely fabricated, were presented with such conviction and detail that they created confusion and doubt among the public and international observers. The parliamentary session that followed the dismissals resembled a show trial more than a democratic debate. Banda supporters dominated the proceedings, making speeches that praised his leadership while condemning the former ministers as traitors and foreign agents. The speed and coordination of these attacks suggested careful planning, indicating that Banda had been preparing for this moment and had already identified which parliamentarians would support him regardless of the circumstances. The transformation from functioning democracy to one-man dictatorship happened with breathtaking speed. After the ministers fled the country, only 2 cabinet members remained supporting Banda, emphasizing how completely he had consolidated power within weeks of the crisis. He appointed loyalists to key positions, ensuring that future cabinet meetings would be rubber stamp sessions rather than genuine policy discussions. The parliamentary system remained in place, but its democratic function was gutted, leaving only the appearance of representative government. The international community's response to the crisis was muted and inadequate. Foreign diplomats and aid agencies were still adjusting to the post-independence reality, and were reluctant to interfere in what they viewed as internal political disputes. The Cold War context made Western governments particularly wary of criticizing leaders who opposed communist influence, even when those leaders were clearly abandoning democratic principles. Banda's anti-communist rhetoric provided him with protective cover from international scrutiny. The former ministers who had challenged Banda faced systematic persecution that would continue for decades. Henry Chipembera fled to Tanzania, where he attempted to organize armed resistance against the Banda regime. Kanyama Kayum also went into exile, spending years trying to mobilize international support for Malawi's democratic opposition. Orton Chirwa managed to escape to Tanzania as well, but his story would take a particularly tragic turn years later when he was kidnapped and forcibly returned to Malawi. The fate of Chirwa illustrated the lengths to which Banda would go to eliminate his enemies. After being kidnapped from Zambia in 1981, Chirwa was secretly returned to Malawi and charged with treason. He spent nearly 11 years in solitary confinement while awaiting execution, enduring conditions that amounted to torture. His death in prison became a symbol of the systematic cruelty that characterized Banda's treatment of political opponents. The cabinet crisis established the template for how Banda would handle all future challenges to his authority. The speed of his response, the fabricated accusations, the use of parliamentary allies to legitimize his actions, and the relentless persecution of opponents became standard operating procedures. This crisis demonstrated that Banda had no intention of sharing power or tolerating dissent, regardless of the democratic principles that had supposedly guided the independence movement. The aftermath of the crisis saw the creation of a new constitution that formalized Banda's dictatorship. The document transformed Malawi into a republic with Banda as the sole candidate for president, granting him extensive executive and legislative powers that rendered the other branches of government meaningless. Parliament went further, declaring him His Excellency the Life President of the Republic of Malawi, a title that eliminated any pretense of democratic governance and established the foundation for the personality cult that would dominate the country for the next 30 years. The cabinet crisis of 1964 marked the death of Malawi's democracy before it had truly begun. The ministers who had fought for independence found themselves exiled, imprisoned, or dead, their vision of a free and democratic Malawi replaced by something far more sinister. With his political opponents eliminated and his power consolidated, Banda was free to reshape Malawi according to his vision, and what emerged would be a system of control so complete that it penetrated every aspect of ordinary life. A totalitarian state perfected. The machinery of control that Banda constructed reached into every corner of Malawian society with surgical precision. Citizens woke each morning to a reality where their government monitored not just their politics and economy, but their clothing, their hairstyles, their reading material, and even their facial expressions. The state's reach extended into the most intimate aspects of human existence, creating a level of control that rivaled the totalitarian systems of North Korea or Stalin's Soviet Union. Every commercial building in Malawi was required to display Banda's portrait, positioned above all other artwork, clocks, or decorations. His image stared down from shop walls, office buildings, schools, and government facilities, creating an omnipresent reminder of his authority. Before every film screening, audiences were forced to stand and watch the national anthem while Banda's image filled the screen. The title Ngwazi, meaning conqueror, became mandatory when referring to him, and citizens learned to speak his name with a reverence typically reserved for religious figures. This personality cult wasn't just encouraged but legally mandated, with severe penalties for those who failed to show proper respect. The regime's control over personal appearance reached absurd extremes. Women were prohibited from wearing trousers, forcing them into long skirts and dresses regardless of the practical demands of their work or the weather. Men faced strict regulations on hair length, with anything longer than collar-length grounds for arrest. Foreign visitors discovered this rule upon arrival, when airport officials would forcibly cut their hair if it exceeded the approved length. These weren't casual suggestions, but rigidly enforced laws with real consequences for violators. Banda's censorship apparatus controlled every piece of information that reached Malawian citizens. The Malawi Daily News became the only permitted newspaper, functioning as a propaganda outlet rather than a source of actual news. A single radio station was allowed to operate, broadcasting only approved content that praised the regime and avoided any topics that might encourage critical thinking. A national censorship board reviewed all films, banning even the depiction of couples kissing, which was considered too provocative for public consumption. The regime's assault on education and intellectual freedom was systematic and devastating. Banda actively discouraged mass education, preferring that the population remain uninformed and easily controlled. Libraries were purged of books that might contain dangerous ideas, with historical volumes being particular targets for destruction. Book burnings became common events, often conducted publicly to demonstrate the consequences of possessing prohibited materials. Foreign teachers who dared to discuss topics that Banda disapproved of faced immediate deportation, while local educators learned to stick to approved curricula or risk imprisonment. The surveillance system that emerged under Banda's rule turned neighbor against neighbor and family member against family member. Citizens were encouraged to report on each other for any signs of disloyalty, creating a network of informants that penetrated every community, workplace, and social group. People learned to watch their words carefully, knowing that a casual comment criticizing government policy could result in arrest, torture, or worse. The paranoia this created was deliberate, as it prevented the formation of any organized opposition to the regime. Basic human freedoms disappeared under the weight of arbitrary regulations and unpredictable enforcement. Citizens needed permission to travel between districts, to change jobs, to marry, or to attend social gatherings. The regime maintained lists of approved books, songs, and topics of conversation, while simultaneously banning anything that might encourage independent thought or criticism of government policies. Even private conversations in people's homes were subject to surveillance, as the regime recruited informants from every level of society. The psychological impact of living under such complete control was profound and lasting. Citizens developed a condition that psychologists now recognize as learned helplessness, where people stop trying to resist or change their circumstances because they've learned that resistance is futile. The arbitrary nature of punishment meant that even perfect compliance offered no guarantee of safety, as citizens could be arrested for crimes they didn't know they had committed or for associating with people they didn't know were considered enemies of the state. Banda's economic control was equally comprehensive, with the dictator personally owning or controlling most of Malawi's major enterprises. This economic stranglehold allowed him to amass a personal fortune estimated at several $100 million, while keeping the majority of Malawians in poverty. Citizens who showed too much economic success or independence were viewed with suspicion, as the regime preferred a population that remained dependent on government approval for their survival. The regime's control over cultural expression was particularly devastating for a society with rich artistic traditions. Malawian writers and poets faced constant scrutiny, with their work examined for any signs of coded criticism or hidden messages. Traditional music and dance were regulated to ensure they contained no elements that might be interpreted as political commentary. Even religious services were monitored, with church leaders required to submit sermon topics for approval before speaking to their congregations. The legal system became a tool of oppression rather than justice. courts existed primarily to provide a veneer of legitimacy for predetermined outcomes, with judges appointed based on their loyalty to Banda rather than their legal expertise. Trials were often conducted in secret, with defendants having no access to legal representation or the right to present evidence in their defense. The death penalty was used liberally, not just for violent crimes but for political offenses that were often vaguely defined and retroactively applied. Citizens learned to live in a state of constant fear, never knowing when they might say or do something that would attract unwanted attention from the authorities. The regime's network of enforcers created a climate where even children couldn't be trusted, as they were taught to report on their own parents for signs of disloyalty. This breakdown of family bonds and social trust had effects that lasted long after the regime's end. The totalitarian control penetrated every aspect of daily life, from the clothes people wore to the thoughts they were allowed to think. The comparison to North Korea's system of control was not accidental but deliberate. Banda studied other totalitarian regimes and adopted their most effective techniques for suppressing dissent and maintaining power. The result was a system that combined the worst elements of various dictatorships into a uniquely oppressive form of government that held an entire population captive for 3 decades. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Banda's control was how he weaponized the innocence of childhood itself, transforming the country's youth into instruments of terror and surveillance. The mechanism for this transformation had been quietly established even before independence, disguised as something far more benign. The Malawi Young Pioneers, terror in uniform. In 1963, Banda established what appeared to be a standard youth development program called the Malawi Young Pioneers. The organization's stated mission focused on rural development projects, agricultural training, and civic education for young people between the ages of 10 and 25. Parents across the country initially welcomed the program, seeing it as an opportunity for their children to receive training in practical skills like carpentry, agriculture, and basic business principles. The early promotional materials emphasized nation-building activities and portrayed the pioneers as a constructive force for Malawi's development. The transformation of the Young Pioneers from a youth service organization into Banda's personal army happened gradually but systematically. Within 2 years of its founding, the organization had expanded far beyond its original mandate. The pioneers received military training from Israeli instructors, who taught them weapons handling, combat techniques, and advanced surveillance methods. This military component wasn't presented as the primary focus, but rather as preparation for defending the nation against external threats and maintaining internal security. The indoctrination process began with children as young as 10 years old, who were taught that Banda was the fountain of all wisdom and the father and founder of the Malawi nation. The psychological manipulation started with seemingly innocent activities like singing songs praising Banda and reciting pledges of loyalty. These exercises gradually intensified into more serious forms of political indoctrination, where children learned to identify enemies of the state and understand their duty to report suspicious behavior. The training camps became total institutions where young people were separated from their families for months at a time, allowing instructors to reshape their worldview completely. The organization's reach extended across the entire country through a network of training bases and recruitment centers. By 1990, about 3,000 recruits were trained annually at pioneer facilities, easily recognizable by their distinctive green and khaki uniforms and military-style berets. The bases functioned as self-contained communities with their own agricultural projects, workshops, and business ventures. The pioneers operated agricultural and commercial enterprises that generated revenue, demonstrating the significant resources Banda allocated to the organization and the autonomous power it wielded within the country. The selection process for pioneer membership often targeted children from poor families, who were attracted by promises of education, regular meals, and future employment opportunities. Once recruited, these young people underwent intensive training that combined practical skills with political indoctrination and military preparation. The most promising recruits received advanced training in surveillance techniques, interrogation methods, and the use of weapons. This tiered system created a hierarchy within the organization, with senior pioneers wielding significant authority over their communities and even over adults. The pioneers' role in surveillance transformed ordinary social interactions into potential threats. Children who joined the organization were taught to monitor their own families, neighbors, and classmates for signs of disloyalty to Banda. They learned to recognize forbidden books, prohibited music, and dangerous conversations. The organization provided rewards for successful informants, creating incentives for betrayal that poisoned relationships throughout Malawian society. Parents learned to watch their words around their own children, while teachers discovered that their students might report them for any deviation from approved curriculum. The enforcement activities carried out by the pioneers went far beyond simple reporting. They conducted raids on homes and businesses, searching for contraband materials and arresting suspected dissidents. The organization maintained its own detention facilities where suspects were interrogated and tortured. The pioneers developed particular expertise in psychological torture techniques, using their knowledge of local customs and family relationships to maximize the impact of their intimidation efforts. They understood exactly which pressures would be most effective against specific individuals or communities. The targeting of religious minorities became one of the pioneers' most systematic campaigns. Jehovah's Witnesses faced particular persecution because their religious beliefs prevented them from participating in mandatory loyalty ceremonies honoring Banda. The pioneers organized raids on kingdom halls, arrested worshippers during religious services, and subjected believers to brutal beatings designed to force them to renounce their faith. These attacks weren't random acts of violence, but coordinated campaigns that followed specific patterns and objectives. The persecution of Malawi's Indian community revealed the pioneers' role in ethnic cleansing operations. The organization conducted systematic harassment campaigns against Indian families, forcing them to abandon their businesses and leave the country. The pioneers seized property, destroyed merchandise, and physically attacked community members while authorities looked the other way. These actions served both ideological and economic purposes, as they eliminated a successful minority group while redistributing their wealth to regime supporters. The psychological impact on the children who served as pioneers created lasting trauma that affected entire generations. Many young people who participated in the organization's activities struggled with guilt and shame long after the regime ended. They had been trained to view violence and betrayal as patriotic duties, creating moral confusion that persisted into adulthood. The organization's emphasis on absolute loyalty to Banda prevented critical thinking and independent moral judgment, leaving former pioneers ill-equipped to function in a democratic society. The families torn apart by the pioneer system experienced trauma that extended far beyond the immediate victims. Parents who discovered that their children had informed on them faced a particular form of betrayal that violated the most fundamental bonds of trust. Siblings found themselves on opposite sides of political conflicts, with some joining the pioneers while others became targets of persecution. The organization's influence created divisions within families that lasted decades, as relatives struggled to rebuild relationships damaged by years of suspicion and fear. The estimates of violence carried out by the pioneers reveal the scope of their terror campaign. Between 6,000 and 18,000 people were killed, tortured, or arbitrarily imprisoned during Banda's rule, with the pioneers serving as the primary perpetrators of these crimes. The organization's systematic approach to violence meant that the death toll represented only a fraction of the total number of people who suffered under their actions. Hundreds of thousands of Malawians experienced intimidation, harassment, or lesser forms of persecution that left lasting psychological scars. The young pioneers represented the most chilling aspect of Banda's regime because they demonstrated how totalitarian control could be achieved through the systematic corruption of childhood innocence. The organization took children who should have been learning basic values like honesty, compassion, and respect for others, and transformed them into instruments of oppression. The long-term damage inflicted by this system extended far beyond the immediate victims to include the perpetrators themselves, creating a legacy of trauma that would take decades to address. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this systematic brutality was not that it happened, but that it happened while the rest of the world watched and did nothing. The world's willful blindness to Malawi's suffering. Western governments possessed detailed knowledge of the systematic oppression occurring within Malawi's borders, yet they consistently chose to maintain their support. The Cold War context provided the perfect justification for this calculated approach. Banda's unwavering anti-communist stance made him a valuable ally in the global struggle against Soviet influence, transforming his brutality from a liability into an asset. Western policymakers viewed his oppressive tactics as necessary measures to maintain stability in a strategically important region. The same characteristics that made him a monster to his own people made him useful to foreign governments seeking reliable partners in their ideological battle. Few foreign governments publicly condemned Banda's regime until the early 1990s, despite widespread knowledge of human rights abuses. The economic relationships that sustained his dictatorship were built on mutual benefit that ignored human cost. Western corporations invested in Malawi's agricultural sector, particularly tobacco production, generating profits that flowed to both foreign investors and the regime. These business partnerships required political stability, which Banda provided through his systematic suppression of dissent. International financial institutions that provided loans and development assistance to Malawi rarely questioned how these resources were used or whether they contributed to the regime's capacity for oppression. Britain's relationship with its former colony was particularly troubling, as it combined historical responsibility with contemporary complicity. British officials maintained regular diplomatic contact with Banda, hosting him for state visits and treating him as a respected leader rather than a dictator. The British government's knowledge of conditions in Malawi was extensive, given their colonial history and ongoing economic interests, yet they consistently chose engagement over confrontation. This approach sent a clear message to other African leaders that human rights violations would not interfere with diplomatic relationships as long as Western interests were protected. The United States government's approach to Banda followed a similar pattern of strategic accommodation. American policymakers appreciated his consistent opposition to communist movements in the region and his willingness to cooperate with Western intelligence agencies. The Reagan administration's emphasis on supporting anti-communist allies worldwide provided additional justification for maintaining relationships with authoritarian leaders like Banda. Congressional hearings occasionally raised concerns about human rights in Malawi, but these discussions never translated into meaningful policy changes or diplomatic pressure. South Africa's apartheid regime found in Banda a valuable African ally who legitimized their international isolation. While most African nations severed ties with South Africa in protest of apartheid, Malawi maintained significant diplomatic and trade relationships that provided both economic benefits and political cover. This partnership was particularly valuable to South Africa because it demonstrated that at least one African leader was willing to work with them despite international condemnation. Malawi also maintained substantial trade ties with Portugal, another pariah state due to its colonial policies in Mozambique and Angola. The aid programs that flowed into Malawi during Banda's rule inadvertently strengthened his grip on power by providing resources he could use to reward supporters and punish opponents. International development organizations focused on technical assistance and infrastructure projects while studiously avoiding questions about governance and human rights. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund provided loans that helped finance government operations, including the security apparatus that maintained Banda's control. These organizations operated under the assumption that economic development would eventually lead to political liberalization, an assumption that proved tragically wrong. The few voices that attempted to expose the truth about conditions in Malawi faced systematic silencing and international indifference. Exiled political leaders like Henry Chipembra and Kanyama Kayum spent decades trying to draw attention to Banda's crimes, but their efforts received minimal media coverage or diplomatic support. Human rights organizations that documented abuses in Malawi found their reports largely ignored by policymakers who had already decided that strategic considerations outweighed humanitarian concerns. The international media showed little interest in a small African country that offered few compelling stories beyond its beautiful lake and scenic landscapes. The United Nations system proved particularly ineffective at addressing the systematic human rights violations occurring in Malawi. The organization's structure gave member states significant protection from external interference, allowing Banda to operate with impunity as long as he maintained diplomatic relationships with key powers. The UN Human Rights Commission, dominated by countries with their own authoritarian tendencies, showed little interest in investigating conditions in Malawi. This institutional paralysis reflected the broader failure of international organizations to prioritize human rights over political convenience. The regional organizations that might have provided leadership in addressing Malawi's human rights crisis were either too weak or too compromised to take meaningful action. The Organization of African Unity operated under a principle of non-interference that prevented criticism of member states' internal policies. This approach, while intended to protect African sovereignty from external interference, actually provided cover for dictators like Banda, who could violate human rights without fear of regional condemnation. The organization's emphasis on unity over accountability created a climate where oppression could flourish unchecked. The moral failure of Western governments' response to Banda's regime extended beyond simple neglect to active complicity. Nations that proclaimed their commitment to human rights and democracy simultaneously provided the diplomatic recognition, economic support, and political cover that enabled his dictatorship to survive for 3 decades. This hypocrisy was particularly damaging because it demonstrated to other potential dictators that oppression would be tolerated as long as it served Western strategic interests. The message was clear. Human rights were negotiable when more important considerations were at stake. The consequences of this willful blindness extended far beyond Malawi's borders to affect the broader credibility of international human rights institutions. The failure to address systematic oppression in Malawi, while simultaneously condemning human rights violations in countries aligned with the Soviet Union, revealed the political nature of human rights advocacy during the Cold War. This selective moral outrage undermined the universal principles that were supposed to guide international relations and contributed to cynicism about Western commitments to human rights and democracy. It was only in 1992 that several major donors finally withdrew their aid, forcing a change in policy. Foreign aid resumed only after the 1994 elections demonstrated a genuine transition to democracy. But by then, an entire generation of Malawians had suffered under a system that the world had chosen to ignore. The international community's 3 decades of calculated indifference had allowed one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships to flourish unchecked. Yet even the most entrenched systems of oppression eventually face pressures that test their foundations. Signs of change. By the late 1980s, the seemingly impenetrable fortress of Banda's dictatorship began showing hairline fractures that would eventually bring down the entire structure. The changes started subtly, with shifts in international politics that most Malawians couldn't see, but that fundamentally altered the calculations keeping their dictator in power. The Berlin Wall's fall in 1989 marked more than just the end of European division. It signaled the conclusion of the ideological struggle that had given authoritarian leaders across Africa their strategic value to Western powers. The Cold War's end meant that anti-communist credentials no longer provided automatic protection from international criticism. Western governments that had overlooked decades of human rights abuses in the name of containing Soviet influence suddenly found themselves without compelling reasons to support brutal dictators. The strategic logic that had made Banda valuable to Washington and London evaporated almost overnight. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank began attaching governance conditions to their lending programs, demanding democratic reforms and human rights improvements as prerequisites for continued financial support. Congressional hearings in the United States began featuring testimony about conditions in Malawi, without the usual counterarguments about communist threats. British parliamentarians started asking uncomfortable questions about their government's relationship with a dictator who had tortured and murdered thousands of his own people. The economic pressure that followed this political shift created immediate consequences for Banda's regime. Foreign aid that had sustained government operations for decades began drying up as donor countries demanded democratic reforms and human rights improvements. Malawi's economy, already struggling under the weight of mismanagement and corruption, faced new strains as international financial support disappeared. The drought that struck southern Africa in the early 1990s exposed the regime's fundamental weakness in ways that years of political oppression had not. Banda's government proved incapable of managing the crisis, leaving millions of Malawians facing starvation, while resources continued flowing to the dictator's personal projects and security apparatus. Within Malawi itself, a new generation of adults was coming of age without the paralyzing fear that had dominated their parents' lives. These younger Malawians had grown up during the regime's most stable period, when the immediate terror of the 1960s and 1970s had settled into routine oppression. They possessed a different relationship with authority than their elders, having never experienced the hope and subsequent crushing disappointment of independence. Their expectations were lower, but their willingness to take risks was higher, creating a demographic shift that would prove crucial to the regime's eventual downfall. The Catholic Church's decision to speak out against the regime marked a turning point that reverberated across the country. In March 1992, the Catholic bishops issued a pastoral letter that directly challenged Banda's authority and condemned the systematic human rights violations that had characterized his rule. The document, titled "Living Our Faith," was read aloud in parishes across the country, reaching hundreds of thousands of Malawians who had never heard such direct criticism of their government. The bishop's moral authority gave legitimacy to opposition voices that had been dismissed as foreign agents or communist sympathizers. The letter's impact extended far beyond the Catholic community, as it provided cover for other religious leaders and civil society organizations to express their own criticism of the regime. Protestant churches that had remained silent for decades began incorporating social justice themes into their sermons. Islamic leaders in the northern regions found new courage to speak about political issues that had been forbidden topics for 30 years. The religious opposition created a moral framework for resistance that transcended ethnic and regional divisions. Underground labor movements that had operated in secret for years began emerging into the open, emboldened by the changing political climate. Workers in the tobacco estates, textile factories, and government offices started organizing strikes and protests that challenged the regime's control over economic life. The most significant of these actions came when labor leader Chikufwa Chihana organized a public rally at Lilongwe International Airport, openly calling for political reform and democratic elections. His arrest sparked widespread protests that the security forces struggled to contain. Widespread university protests erupted across the country, with students at the University of Malawi organizing demonstrations that directly challenged the regime's authority. The scale of these protests forced the government to partially lift restrictions in 1992, creating new space for political expression that had been forbidden for decades. The regime's attempts to suppress these activities only generated more support for the student movement, as their courage inspired others to take similar risks. The emergence of independent civil society organizations represented another crack in the regime's foundation. Professional associations, women's groups, and human rights organizations that had operated as social clubs suddenly began advocating for political change. These groups provided organizational structures that could mobilize popular support for democratic reforms while operating within the existing legal framework. Their activities demonstrated that civil society could function independently of government control, undermining one of the regime's fundamental assumptions about social organization. The international media attention that accompanied these developments created new pressures on the regime. Foreign journalists who had previously ignored Malawi began reporting on the growing opposition movement, bringing international scrutiny to bear on Banda's government. The BBC's coverage of events in Malawi reached audiences across southern Africa, while international human rights organizations began documenting abuses with unprecedented detail and distribution. Economic strikes that began in specific sectors spread across the country, creating a general atmosphere of resistance that the security forces found difficult to contain. Government workers, teachers, and healthcare professionals participated in work stoppages that crippled basic services and demonstrated the regime's dependence on popular cooperation. The strikes revealed that the apparatus of control was more fragile than it appeared, requiring active participation from the population to function effectively. The regime's response to these challenges revealed its fundamental weakness. The Malawi young pioneers, once feared across the country, found their authority increasingly challenged by ordinary citizens who refused to show them the deference they had come to expect. Local government officials began quietly refusing to implement the most oppressive policies, creating space for opposition activities to flourish. The personality cult surrounding Banda began showing signs of strain as people stopped participating in the mandatory displays of loyalty with their previous enthusiasm. External and internal pressures converged to create a situation where change became inevitable rather than merely possible. The regime's international isolation combined with domestic resistance to produce a crisis that could no longer be managed through traditional methods of repression. The foundation of Banda's power, built on fear, isolation, and international support, had developed cracks that would soon become structural failures. What nobody anticipated was how quickly these mounting pressures would force a confrontation that would determine Malawi's future. The miracle of 1994. Democracy against all odds. The confrontation came in March 1993, when Banda made an announcement that stunned even his closest advisors. He agreed to hold a national referendum on whether Malawi should transition from a one-party state to a multi-party democracy. The decision seemed to come from nowhere, as Banda had shown no previous inclination toward democratic reform. His announcement created immediate confusion among both supporters and opponents, as nobody understood why a dictator who had maintained absolute power for 3 decades would suddenly risk everything on a popular vote. The referendum campaign that followed was unlike anything Malawians had experienced in their lifetimes. For the first time since independence, citizens could openly discuss the merits of different political systems without fear of arrest or punishment. The campaign revealed the depth of opposition to Banda's rule, as massive rallies supporting multi-party democracy drew crowds that dwarfed the mandatory pro-government gatherings of previous decades. The enthusiasm was particularly striking among young people who had never participated in any form of political activity. The voting process itself became a powerful symbol of democratic participation. On referendum day in October 1993, Malawians lined up at polling stations across the country in numbers that overwhelmed election officials. The turnout reached 67% of registered voters, a remarkable figure for a population that had been terrorized into political passivity for 30 years. Many voters arrived before dawn and waited hours for their chance to cast ballots, treating the opportunity as a sacred responsibility rather than a routine civic duty. The results exceeded even the most optimistic projections of democracy advocates. Nearly 2/3 of voters chose the multi-party option in a landslide victory that eliminated any possibility of disputes over the outcome. More significantly, the geographic distribution of the vote showed that support for democracy crossed regional and ethnic lines, with only a few districts showing majorities for the one-party system. The results demonstrated that the desire for political change had become nearly universal among the Malawian population. International observers from the United Nations and Commonwealth documented a remarkably smooth and transparent process, providing legitimacy that helped build confidence among voters who had never participated in a free election. Their presence offered crucial validation of the results and helped prevent any attempts to manipulate the outcome. The period between the referendum and the subsequent presidential elections in 1994 saw the systematic dismantling of the oppressive apparatus that had controlled Malawian society for decades. The censorship board was dissolved, allowing newspapers and radio stations to operate freely for the first time. Political prisoners were released from detention facilities across the country, many of them emerging after years of solitary confinement. The Malawi Young Pioneers, once the most feared organization in the country, were disbanded and their weapons confiscated. The presidential campaign of 1994 featured multiple candidates representing different political parties, a sight that seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Banda himself decided to run for president, presenting himself as a reformed leader who had guided the country through a peaceful transition to democracy. His main opponents included Bekele Muluzi of the United Democratic Front and Chikufwa Chihana of the Alliance for Democracy, both of whom had been imprisoned or harassed during the dictatorship. The electoral process revealed the extent to which Malawian society had been transformed by the democratic opening. Campaign rallies drew massive crowds who listened to candidates debate policy issues that had been forbidden topics for decades. The media covered the campaigns extensively, providing voters with information about the candidates' positions on economic development, human rights, and regional integration. Civil society organizations that had operated underground for years emerged to educate voters about the democratic process and their rights. The presidential election results on May 17, 1994, delivered the final blow to Banda's political career. Bekele Muluzi won with 47.3% of the vote, while Banda received only 33.1%. The margin was decisive enough to avoid a runoff election, and the results were accepted by all parties without significant dispute. The geographic distribution of the vote showed that Banda's support was concentrated in the central region, his traditional stronghold, while opposition candidates won majorities in the north and south. The most remarkable aspect of the entire transition was Banda's response to his electoral defeat. Rather than attempting to overturn the results through violence or legal challenges, he accepted the outcome with a grace that surprised even his harshest critics. He offered his cooperation to the incoming government and publicly urged his supporters to respect the democratic process. This behavior was particularly striking given his history of eliminating opponents through imprisonment, torture, and murder. The peaceful transfer of power that followed the elections completed a transformation that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Muluzi was sworn in as president in a ceremony attended by international dignitaries and thousands of Malawians who had never witnessed a democratic transition. The new government immediately began implementing reforms that had been promised during the campaign, including the establishment of a Human Rights Commission and the creation of a more independent judiciary. The success of Malawi's democratic transition became a model for other African countries struggling with authoritarian rule. The peaceful nature of the change demonstrated that even the most oppressive dictatorships could be dismantled without violence if the right conditions were present. The combination of international pressure, domestic opposition, and the dictator's own recognition that his time had passed created a unique opportunity for transformation. The courage displayed by ordinary Malawians during the transition period was perhaps the most inspiring aspect of the entire process. People who had been terrified of expressing political opinions for decades suddenly found the strength to demand democratic rights and participate in free elections. Their determination to create a better future for their children overcame the fear that had paralyzed them for so long. The events of 1993 and 1994 established a new foundation for Malawian society, one based on democratic participation rather than authoritarian control. The transition proved that even populations that had been systematically oppressed could find the courage to choose freedom when given the opportunity. Yet, as the celebrations of victory faded and the new government took office, the magnitude of the challenges ahead would soon become apparent. The rocky road to democracy challenges, and setbacks. Bekele Muluzi inherited a nation that had been systematically stripped of its human and economic resources for 3 decades. The statistics were staggering. Literacy rates hovered around 62%, with rural areas showing even lower figures. Child mortality rates ranked among the world's highest, making Malawi one of the most dangerous places to be born. The economy had been reduced to subsistence agriculture and a handful of tobacco estates, leaving the new government with virtually no revenue base to fund basic services. The institutional framework that democracies require simply didn't exist in post-dictatorship Malawi. The civil service had been designed to implement orders from above, rather than serve citizens or develop policy. The judiciary had functioned as an extension of Banda's will for 30 years, leaving judges with little experience in independent legal reasoning. The military and police forces had been trained to suppress dissent rather than protect citizens, creating security institutions that viewed the population as potential threats rather than constituents to serve. These institutional weaknesses meant that even well-intentioned reforms often failed in their implementation. Muluzi's early presidency showed promise with policies that addressed some of the dictatorship's most oppressive features. He established press freedom, allowing independent newspapers and radio stations to operate without government censorship. His administration implemented free primary education, opening schools to hundreds of thousands of children who had been excluded from formal learning. Political prisoners were released from detention facilities across the country, and the notorious Malawi Young Pioneers were formally disbanded. These changes created visible improvements in daily life that gave many citizens hope for continued progress. However, the World Bank's economic reform requirements created immediate hardships that undermined public support for the new government. The structural adjustment programs demanded currency devaluation, removal of food subsidies, and privatization of state enterprises. These policies triggered severe inflation that eroded the purchasing power of ordinary Malawians who were already struggling with poverty. The currency devaluation made imported goods prohibitively expensive, while the removal of subsidies increased food prices at a time when most families were already malnourished. Citizens who had expected democracy to bring economic relief instead found themselves facing higher costs for basic necessities. The corruption scandals that emerged during Muluzi's presidency revealed how quickly democratic institutions could be compromised by personal enrichment. His administration faced accusations of misusing grain reserves during a severe food shortage that resulted in famine conditions across much of the country. The alleged mismanagement of emergency food supplies meant that people died of hunger while resources were being diverted for political purposes. These corruption cases eroded public trust in the new government and raised questions about whether democracy had simply replaced one form of exploitation with another. The ethnic tensions that had been suppressed during the dictatorship erupted into violence during the 1999 elections, revealing deep social divisions that democratic institutions struggled to manage. The contest between Muluzi, who belonged to the Muslim Yao ethnic group, and his opponents triggered communal violence that targeted religious minorities. Over 200 mosques were attacked or destroyed, while police forces showed clear bias in their responses to different communities. These ethnic conflicts demonstrated that democracy alone couldn't resolve historical grievances or create social unity. The persistence of structural weaknesses became apparent as successive governments struggled with the same fundamental problems that had plagued the transition. The civil service remained inefficient and corrupt, unable to deliver basic services to citizens who had voted for change. The judiciary continued to lack independence and resources, making it difficult to enforce laws or protect constitutional rights. The military and police forces retained their authoritarian culture, viewing civilian oversight with suspicion and resistance. These institutional failures created a cycle where democratic governments couldn't deliver the improvements that citizens expected, leading to disillusionment and political instability. The concentration of power in the presidency, inherited from the Banda era, made it difficult to develop the checks and balances that healthy democracies require. Parliament remained weak and subservient to executive authority, while civil society organizations lacked the resources and experience necessary to hold government accountable. The economic challenges that accompanied democratic governance proved particularly difficult to address. The country's narrow economic base, dependent on tobacco exports and vulnerable to international price fluctuations, provided little foundation for sustainable development. The lack of infrastructure, educated workforce, and investment capital made it difficult to diversify the economy or create employment opportunities for a rapidly growing population. These economic limitations constrained the government's ability to fund social services or invest in long-term development projects. The international community's approach to supporting Malawi's democratic transition often created additional complications. Donor countries and international organizations imposed conditions on aid that sometimes conflicted with local priorities or democratic decision-making processes. The emphasis on rapid economic liberalization and structural adjustment programs created hardships that undermined popular support for democratic governance. The conditionality attached to foreign assistance also limited the government's policy options and sovereignty. The ongoing struggle between democratic and authoritarian impulses revealed that political culture changes much more slowly than political institutions. While Malawi had adopted democratic structures, the behaviors and attitudes that support democratic governance took longer to develop. The persistence of ethnic divisions, the weakness of civil society organizations, and the concentration of power in the presidency all contributed to the fragility of democratic governance. The challenges of democratic consolidation in Malawi demonstrated that freedom alone was insufficient to solve the deep-rooted problems created by decades of authoritarian rule. The transition to democracy was just the beginning of a longer process of institutional development, cultural change, and economic transformation. Yet despite these setbacks and struggles, the foundations of democratic governance had been established, and the country's trajectory was fundamentally different from the dark decades that preceded it. A democratic success story. Today, 3 decades after the fall of one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships, Malawi stands as proof that even the most oppressive systems can be transformed through sustained democratic commitment. The 2025 statistics tell a story that would have been unimaginable during the dark years of Banda's rule. The country's human freedom score stands at 6.89, placing it in the partly free category globally, with a personal freedom score of 7.52 and an economic freedom score of 5.87. This ranking represents a dramatic improvement from the complete absence of freedom that characterized the dictatorship years, when basic human rights were systematically violated and political expression was punishable by death. The economic indicators for 2025 show a nation that has achieved modest but consistent growth despite significant challenges. The African Development Bank projects economic growth of 3.8% for 2025, driven by expansion in mining, retail, and tourism sectors, while the International Monetary Fund offers a more conservative estimate of 2.4% real GDP growth. These figures reflect steady progress for a country that was economically devastated by decades of mismanagement and corruption under authoritarian rule. The economy faces headwinds including international reserve shortages and macroeconomic instability, but these challenges are being addressed through democratic institutions rather than authoritarian decree. The literacy rate has reached 68% as of 2022, representing a significant increase from previous decades. This improvement demonstrates the sustained commitment to education that began with the democratic transition. The government continues to address the remaining illiteracy through adult education programs, recognizing that educational advancement is crucial for continued democratic development. These literacy gains would have been impossible under Banda's regime, which actively discouraged mass education to maintain control over the population. The 2025 general elections, scheduled for September 16, represent another milestone in Malawi's democratic journey. President Lazarus Chakwera of the Malawi Congress Party faces challenges from 2 former presidents, Peter Mutharika and Joyce Banda, in a contest that demonstrates the peaceful transfer of power between competing political parties. The requirement that winning candidates must secure more than 50% of the vote increases the possibility of a second round, which may involve coalition building among parties. This electoral system reflects the institutional maturity that has developed since the chaotic early years of democracy. The death of Vice President Solos Chilima in a plane crash in June 2024 reshaped the political landscape but did not destabilize the democratic system. The peaceful succession process and continued preparation for elections demonstrate the resilience of Malawi's democratic institutions. The civic institutions and courts that will oversee the electoral process have shown increasing independence from political interference, marking a significant departure from the complete subordination of these institutions under dictatorship. Modern development initiatives showcase Malawi's commitment to technological advancement and transparency. The Digital Malawi Acceleration Project, launched in November 2024, aims to connect 2,000 schools and provide support for digital identification systems. The project includes an affordable devices program designed to help low-income users purchase mobile phones and laptops, expanding access to digital technology across economic classes. The Malawi Infrastructure Projects portal, launched in 2018, demonstrates the government's commitment to transparency in public spending by allowing government departments to disclose information on infrastructure projects and contract details from tender to completion. This level of transparency would have been inconceivable under Banda's regime, where government operations were shrouded in secrecy and public resources were treated as personal property. The transformation of civil society and media freedom represents one of the most dramatic changes since the democratic transition. Independent newspapers, radio stations, and civil society organizations now operate freely, providing platforms for public debate and government accountability. The media landscape that emerged after 1994 continues to evolve, with digital platforms expanding access to information across the country. This media freedom contrasts sharply with the single government-controlled newspaper and radio station that existed under dictatorship. Malawi's role in regional democratic leadership has grown significantly since the transition. The country serves as a model for peaceful democratic transitions and has contributed to regional stability through its participation in international organizations. The 2025 Global Peace Index ranks Malawi as the 71st most peaceful country globally, with a score of 6.89 and a societal safety and security score of 26.4. This ranking reflects the country's evolution from a source of regional instability to a contributor to continental peace and security. The Anti-Corruption Bureau's increased independence from political influences represents another significant achievement in institutional development. During the 3-year tenure of Director General Martha Chizuma, the Bureau investigated a record 119 cases, including high-profile politicians involved in bribery and procurement fraud. While Chizuma faced institutional obstacles and eventually resigned in 2024 after the Bureau was starved of funds, the investigation record demonstrates the institution's potential for holding powerful figures accountable. This accountability mechanism would have been impossible under authoritarian rule, when corruption was systematic and unchecked. The Malawi 2063 Vision, launched in January 2021, outlines the country's long-term development strategy to become a wealthy, self-reliant, industrialized upper-middle-income country. The vision focuses on agriculture commercialization, industrialization, and urbanization, representing a comprehensive approach to economic transformation. This strategic planning capacity demonstrates the institutional maturity that has developed since the democratic transition, when government planning was limited to maintaining regime control rather than promoting national development. The challenges that remain are significant but manageable within the democratic framework. The poverty rate of 72%, below the $2.15 international poverty line, reflects the ongoing struggle to improve living conditions for the majority of Malawians. The economy's dependence on rain-fed agriculture and vulnerability to climate change pose continuing risks to growth and development. The The budget deficit, projected at 8.7% of GDP in 2025, reflects the costs of democratic governance and the need to provide services to citizens rather than enriching a small elite. However, these challenges are being addressed through transparent processes and international cooperation rather than authoritarian methods. The distance traveled from dictatorship to democracy demonstrates that transformation is possible even when circumstances seem hopeless. Malawi's achievement shows that geographic isolation, economic poverty, and historical trauma need not prevent democratic development. The country's success stands as evidence that oppressed populations can find the strength to demand change and build something better from the ruins of tyranny. The lessons from Malawi's transformation extend far beyond its borders, offering insights into how institutional development unfolds in post-authoritarian societies. The country's 2025 Freedom House rating of partly free reflects the ongoing fragility of its democratic gains, demonstrating that political transitions require decades of sustained effort rather than single moments of change. The institutional weaknesses, corruption scandals, and authoritarian impulses that persist remind us that democratic consolidation is a gradual process requiring constant citizen engagement and vigilance. The contrast between 1994 and 2025 reveals the magnitude of what has been accomplished. Malawi has evolved from a one-party state where political opposition meant death or exile to a competitive democracy where 15 political parties are preparing to contest the 2025 elections, representing the full spectrum of political opinion and regional interests.